Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Guadalupe Molina. I'm a third year at UCI, and I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. And I'm very excited to be virtually sharing space with you. I hope that wherever you are, whatever time it is, whenever you're watching this, that you're feeling at peace, or that maybe that this information will help you feel some kind of peace or healing. But yeah, so I will be talking today about communal care and collective healing, and specifically during COVID-19, kind of these new circumstances or contexts that we're in that bring out these systems of oppression that have always existed, but maybe people are experiencing them even more so heightened. So, how can we combat these systems of oppression? We do that through communal care. Sometimes, in my experience, as a queer person, a brown person coming from a low income immigrant community, self-care, either one, wasn't enough, or two, it wasn't accessible to me or my community. So how can we sustain ourselves under these systems of oppression like capitalism to continue going? And once we keep sustaining ourselves through these avenues of communal care, how can we heal from experiences of violence, of oppression, whether that's interpersonal experiences, healing under the university, right? As students, students that are experiencing forms of oppression that are heightened by the university, and then now under COVID-19, right? Because one way or another, we're all impacted by the situation. So how can we care for each other and heal together during this time of a pandemic, and always? But yeah, very exciting. All right, so some learning outcomes for this presentation, are just kind of things that I will be going over. So the first is distinguishing self-care from communal care. And with that, kind of why or how communal care can be more sustainable than self-care. Like I kind of introduced earlier, these ways that we're kind of told to self-care are not always accessible, or maybe are only band-aids to the larger problem, right? So addressing these larger problems by creating networks of care, always, but especially right now in times of crisis. And creating these networks of care, communal care, rooted in anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia, kind of understanding how our communal care is really rooted in tearing these systems down, and caring for each other so that we survive, so that we thrive, so that we sustain ourselves, so that we can continue in the struggle against these systems of oppression that are replicated and very much exist at our university, right? But yeah, and finally, healing collectively as self-preservation. So we have our own individual healing journeys, but when we share that together, that is also us preserving ourselves, right? But yeah, so these are just a few of the things that I will be going over for today. So understanding self-care and why we need it, especially when we're talking about mental health. As people who are watching this, I am assuming that you care about mental health, whether that be your own or for others, and especially during these times, right? So why do we need self-care? And I think usually the way that self-care is kind of understood is that we do it to take care of ourselves in times of crisis. So we turn to activities or things, material items sometimes, that we are told that give us some kind of release or pleasure. So I go to Ulta, and the very first thing I see is like all these like advertisements and posters saying how this Tatcha face mask will help me relax after a long day of work or something. Um, and so we kind of understand. And then also, that's like kind of like just talking about it in relation to makeup and stuff like that, or like skincare, stuff like that. But sometimes, like, I know, like, I'll just be like, oh my God, like, I'm not going to finish this assignment tonight. It's self care. And then people are like, yes, it's self-care. And so it's kind of like we do these things to give us pleasure or to kind of forget about the larger issues that are going on with us, right? So we commonly understand self-care as needed when life becomes too difficult or too unbearable, or even after we hit burnout, right? And burnout is, for me, there's so many other people that talk about burnout, but I know for me, burnout is when you work yourself too hard without rest, and maybe without sharing this burden with other people to the point where you cannot keep going on. Whether this is physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, this also comes in terms of when you no longer have mental capacity to keep doing these things, right? So we understand the need to self care after we burn out, which is not always the case, right? The point of self-care is to continue building a life where you don't need to escape it, but that's not always accessible. So that's where this whole issue comes in. But so kind of unpacking our understanding of self-care too. So I really love this um, kind of cartoon thing. I think it really breaks down what the artist Diana calls the unspoken complexity of self-care. I will link this in the references that I have at the end, but I think this is a beautiful cartoon that helped me really understand self-care, communal care, and also differentiating between self-care and self-soothing, right? So this cartoon says self-care is thrown around a lot as a magic bullet to solve all of your problems. If you'd only take 1 second to treat yourself, you'd be fine. But what does self-care really mean? And then kind of understanding the difference between self-care versus self-soothing. And I think a lot of the things that are kind of seen as self-care are actually self-soothing, but I do want to acknowledge that maybe something that is self-care for someone is self-soothing for someone else, and vice versa. Or sometimes something that is self-care for you right now may be self-soothing for you in the past or in the future. So these are all very nuanced things and very personal to us. But just to kind of start understanding these different terms and what they mean to us in order to best support ourselves and the people around us. So with self-soothing, for me, these are some examples of things that are self-soothing. So calling off of work, we wake up in the morning, you don't want to work, binging TV or Netflix, there's a lot of great things to watch. Exercise is not something that I do often, but when I do, it's very self-soothing in the moment, because I feel like I'm doing something, then flush of endorphins right after, showering, especially after going through a very difficult period of time as someone who struggles with depression, after going through a period of depression, those showers really hit different. And of course, substances. So things like alcohol, things like weed, alcohol and substance abuse, things like this that kind of create these highs or like these like different like kind of levels of where you're at mentally, that's affected by it, right? So maybe you're not addressing the things that are actually bothering you or things that you have to deal with emotionally. And so like Diana the artist says of this cartoon, these are such delightful things, right? Self-soothing is incredibly important to our well-being. Sometimes, though, these activities may not actually get at stabilizing you or creating opportunities for you to move forward. So, self-soothing is those instant gratification things, right? It's those things that automatically, once we do them, it gives us pleasure, but this pleasure isn't sustained. And that's what self-care is all about. Self-care is these activities, these outlets, these opportunities that sustain your well-being and your mental health. So some examples of this is, so self-care, going to therapy. Therapy is amazing. Therapy is beautiful. It is so helpful no matter how old you are. Setting boundaries, which can be really, really difficult, because we often think of setting boundaries only with romantic partners. But this is something that can be done and should be done with our interpersonal relationships, whether we do this at work, whether we do this with our friends, whether we do this with our families. Setting boundaries is very, very important for self-care. Seeking medical care, especially after not having seeked it for super long, right? And then nourishing yourself through meals. So eating things that nourish your body, things that make you feel good, things that give you energy. But yeah, so self-care is taking care of yourself, doing activities and practices that ground you, heal you, and help you grow. Like I said before, creating a life that you don't need to escape from through self-soothing. So self-care, doing these kind of things, is a way for us to build a life that we don't need to escape from using drugs, using alcohol, using these other avenues that feel good but don't necessarily advance us forward in our well-being, in our growth, in understanding our capacities and our power. But creating a life that you don't need to escape from is not available to everyone. And so this is something that I think is important that we should ask ourselves. So what access do marginalized students and communities have to avenues of self-care, and especially now in this pandemic? Think about it, especially for folks who maybe don't have to think twice about accessing medical care or therapy. Um, yeah, if you want to take a minute to think about that. All right. In relation to this question, I think that marginalized students and communities, um, in my own experience, it's all about survival and not about doing things that can sustain us and our mental health and our well-being holistically. So coming from a working class background, it was all about working. You get offered that extra day of work on your day off, you take it because you need money to sustain yourselves. But what about, like, so it's like you want them to take that day off because it'll be good for them, but sometimes low income folks don't have a choice. It's either let me take care of myself or let me address like my bigger needs. So it's like not about attacking someone for not engaging in self-care or self-soothing activities, but rather thinking critically about these systems in place, in this example, capitalism, that make it so that we can't take care of ourselves, or we don't prioritize these things as maybe other people are able to. And so this gets into the nuances of self-care, right? So acknowledging that it takes social capital, social privilege, economic and racial privilege and capital to be able to self-care, especially during these times. And what I mean by these terms, capital and privilege, so social capital, being of someone that is of is benefiting from systems in place, so benefiting from capitalism. So benefiting from capitalism means that you're not actively worried about where money's going to come from. You're actively not worrying about where your next meal is going to come from. You're actively not worrying about applying to CalFresh, things like that. You don't have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from when you're a UCI student, for example, because you can afford a meal plan, or you can afford, you're not food insecure. So things like that. Economic and racial privilege, of course. Racial privilege is a big one. If you don't have to think about it, it's privilege. So if you can navigate the world without experiencing, whether it's uprooted violence like police violence or state violence, it is privilege. If you can navigate the world without xenophobic comments, especially as we're seeing now for Asian American folks in this pandemic, it is privilege. So being able to self-care during these times takes privilege and takes a certain level of positionality that is not always available to marginalized folks. So this is why we need community care. What is community care and what does that look like? So, oh my gosh, Canva's so weird. All right, so community care is a response to these systems of oppression that don't inherently support care. So these structures that we have in place using UCI as an example. UCI is an example of an institution that does not inherently support care for all students. So UCI, for example, has these resource centers or these, just like all these spaces and centers and people that are supposed to be serving students. But take, for example, the counseling center. That's not always something that's accessible to students, because at the counseling center, you're only given 10 sessions with a therapist or a psychologist until you're referred out. And that is like an even longer process because of insurance, lack of insurance, things like that. And so community care is really tackling these systems of oppression together in order to sustain each other and alleviate the stress and the overwhelmingness that these institutions and these systems create. And our communities have done this for centuries. Indigenous practices, for example, are rooted in collectivism, taking care of each other, looking out for each other. America and the United States specifically is so, because of capitalism, and so individualistic. It's really just like me, and not assuming collective responsibility. So you may, it's kind of like the bystander effect, this individualist capitalist culture. You don't see the suffering of other people. We don't see the suffering of other people as a personal responsibility. Or at least we're not taught to think like that, right? It's kind of like this every man for themselves kind of thing. And this is what leads to burnout. This is what leads to people not actively caring for themselves. And that's why community care is so important, especially now when people are struggling more than ever. People are being unemployed. People are not, maybe, especially like for folks with like physical touch, quality time, love languages, right? Even that emotional support, the lack of it is really heightened during these times, and for marginalized folks especially. So community care is a response to all of these and really tackling these systems to challenge these individualistic notions. So Deanna, the artist, also goes into examples of what community care doesn't look like. So workarounds for systems that don't inherently support care, such as capitalism. So things like childcare and education collectives. Of course, this is not a great example right now because of a pandemic, social distancing, but just to kind of understand, right, that would look like a collective of people who are invested in caring for children. That is something accessible for parents, right? Intimate relationships outside of traditional romantic childhood norms. Worker-owned co-ops, skill sharing and mutual aid, sharing the knowledge that you have with other people, mutual aid, which I will touch on a little bit later. But so community care, and like this is kind of like very formal things like co-housing, co-ops, credit unions, but community care could literally also just be like giving your neighbor oranges from your tree, reaching out to your neighbors, talking to your neighbors. That is so important. So things like that. It doesn't have to be super formal or through an organization or anything. It just has to be reaching out, looking out for people, caring for each other, creating these cultures of care. And what does this look like in a pandemic? Something that I have been hearing in a lot of spaces is that virtual does not mean disconnected. Just because we're not physically together, you're not physically with the people that you would normally be sharing space with, does not mean that you have to be disconnected. And like I said before, getting to know our neighbors is a big one, especially for UCI students. If you have not already knocked on your neighbor's door and introduced yourself and let them know that you're here if they need anything, do it now. It is so, so important to get to know the people who you are sharing space with, even physically. Doesn't have to be like you have to be best friends or anything, but let's start normalizing this culture of knowing each other, of making space, taking space, but also sharing space. And then supporting mutual aid efforts. So mutual aid is an example of community care. So mutual aid is a direct response to these like forms of oppression. So it's a lot of people have been organizing mutual aid funds, for example. So they'll start GoFundMe's for folks that have been losing their jobs and their forms of employment. UCI has a mutual aid campaign running, organized by some dope grads and undergrads, supporting UCI for COLA, which I will get into later as well. But yeah, supporting that however you can. If you're someone that has economic privilege, distribute your funds. That's something that I have on here as well, redistributing your funds. If you feel guilty about having money, release it during these times. You have no idea how meaningful $5 can go to someone who's really struggling right now. Yeah, moving beyond individuality and assuming collective responsibility is something that I was talking about earlier. We should all, it should be normal for us to feel affected by what is happening to other people around us. Even if we can't, even if we feel like these systems of oppression make us feel like we can't do anything about it, but we can support each other, we can care for each other, we can give each other oranges, we can give each other $5, whatever you can. You can translate for someone, you can, we all have knowledge and we all have cultural wealth is what I like to call it, or what I like to say, inspired by Dr. Yoso. Y'all should look her up. We all have these funds of knowledge that we pull from that we have used to sustain ourselves, and I say we as in marginalized folks, and we can share that with each other to sustain each other. And then finally, check-ins and healing spaces. So whether that is you texting someone, hey, how are you holding up? How are you coping? Healing spaces, doing this together. I know it's really awkward on Zoom sometimes, but trust me, my experience when it's better to just reach out and have these spaces than to just not be talking to each other at all, especially during a time where maybe folks are not always talking to themselves. I know if I didn't live with roommates, I would probably go the whole day without talking to someone too. So yeah, this is kind of examples of what caring for a community looks like during a pandemic. So caring for each other so we can survive. And so this is what structural care looks like, right? So we care for each other so that we can keep working towards a future that tears down structures that do not care for us and build new ones that do. So I have been in organizing circles and spaces. I have been organizing for about almost 2 years now, since the beginning of my first year. And organizing is hard. Being in these spaces is really hard to always be actively tearing down these structures. It's exhausting. And what has really gotten me and other folks, other comrades through is that community care, because we don't have structural care, right? We don't always have a living wage. We don't usually have paid leave. We don't have liberation. We don't have efficient public transportation. We do not have universal health care, but we do have is each other. So really relying on these networks of support. What can you give and what do you need? And this is why community care and mutual aid is actively rooted in these in anti-racism and anti-oppression, anti-imperialism, because we are saying essentially fuck you to all of these systems that make it so that we feel alone and isolated, and kind of like forces us to work numerous jobs to make a living wage, for example. So we care for each other so that we can keep imagining what a good world that benefits all of us will look like. And then this is also to highlight the need for community care and healing during COVID-19. And I like this graphic from buildingmovement.org. Also will be linked at the end, but I put the website down there for reference. This is kind of an idea, a glimpse of how marginalized communities are being affected by this pandemic. So higher risk and illness and death for Black communities. If you look it up, COVID is literally genocide towards Black folks. Black folks are disproportionately being killed at a much larger rate than anyone else in the US from COVID-19. Health risks for LGBTQIA communities. Undocumented people, they have been left out of the stimulus checks in the US. Access to care for indigenous communities, folks that are living out in like tribes and stuff like that, right? Increased rates of unemployment, anti-Asian racism, all of these things that have been being experienced by marginalized folks, but have been even more so heightened now in this pandemic. And hence why we need community care and healing. And we all have a role to play. I think a reason why folks don't organize or feel like they see themselves as an organizer is because we don't often make everyone feel like they can take a role in making social change. So I just wanted to include this really quick. Feel free to pause or click on this website to kind of look more into this, but I really like this framework. This is called Mapping Our Roles in a Social Change Ecosystem. So at the center is the world that we are working towards, which is liberation, justice, solidarity, resiliency. But in order to make this happen, we need everyone on the outside, absolutely everyone, and not one person will take up all of these roles. And that's why we need everyone working together collectively to create institutions of care. So we have, for example, I see myself as a caregiver. So whether that's caring for other people, children especially, providing childcare and stuff like that, I would say that is my role in a social change ecosystem, as well as, I would say, a guide. I know I have been inspired by other guides to really acknowledge the power that I have in a social change ecosystem to continue to build a world that we don't have to escape from, a world where we're not being charged rent during a pandemic. So I encourage you all to think critically, reflect on how you see yourself, because everyone has a role to play. And of course, this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the roles, but just to kind of start seeing ourselves through a growth mindset, and start acknowledging our power and start acknowledging the knowledge and skills that we have to create a new world, to build a new world. We all have something, and we all need each other. So just find out what that is for you. And this brings us to community healing. So we talked a lot about work, emotional work of creating these communities of care, but we also need to heal. And community healing is the active, critical process of tending to emotional wounds caused by traumatic experiences. And then when we think about radical healing is also a response to these systems of oppression that traumatize us, right? So I know for me, I've had to heal from experiences of my own background before I got to UCI, but as a marginalized student with the various different marginalized identities that I possess, I have had to heal from experiences at UCI. So community care is about tending to immediate material needs of a community, like food insecurity or funds for rent or anything like that. But community healing is about our own individual personal healing and bringing it back to collective healing, because I kind of think of it as the Filipinx kind of phrase, isang baksak, which is used a lot in organizing spaces, which means one rise, all rise, one fall, all fall. So when one of us heals, that inspires the rest of us to heal. But yes. And community healing is all about holding space for each other's joy, for our sorrow, for laughter. It is all about making space, taking up space, and sharing that space. And that is something that I have learned from a very, very knowledgeable friend. See, all about sharing, skill sharing, sharing the knowledge. holding space is not about unloading our feelings onto a specific person, but it's about letting things that we have experienced off of our chests, and maybe that burden is easier to hold with someone else, consensually, of course. So whether this is through a crying Zoom session or, I don't know, like a phone call with like your friends, where you're just like intentionally just talking about things that y'all have been going through. Community healing happens when we hold space for each other. Um, we provide advice if it's needed. We provide emotional support as much as we can. But it's all about holding space. And so again, I encourage y'all to pause this video or visit this website, but this is something that I found from the Sea Hearts Collaborative in Illinois. They do very powerful community healing work, and this framework is kind of like, so we see community healing in the middle, and it's kind of like facilitated through these values of justice. So it's like we're actively working towards justice, whatever that looks like, in our own fight for collective liberation from systems of oppression. And we do this through sharing our stories. I think that is such a beautiful, beautiful way of community healing, is storytelling, sharing our stories of resistance. So community healing is a choice to actively resist against these systems of oppression that really just cause these experiences of trauma. So the values are kind of like collective memory, and that is through storytelling. So sharing our stories and making it known, making it verbalized. Connectedness. Community healing is all about connectedness. And then critical consciousness. So having that critical consciousness of it being like you're actively working towards a new world. But yes, I linked this also. I encourage you all to read up more about this framework, but I think this is a beautiful way of understanding how community healing is so expansive and so large, and the impact that it has is just monumental. And it's so much more beautiful when you can share it with other people. And just to kind of close, I saw this very, very beautiful graphic by this artist, Annika Isara. I believe that is how you say their name. But yeah, they post very, very beautiful graphics of very important lessons. And one of my favorites is lessons taught by gardens. And they kind of go through 10 different lessons that are taught by gardens. And my favorite lesson was lesson number 9, which is communal care is necessary. So for them, gardens have taught them that communal care is necessary. So many trees, with the help of fungi, have underground networks of root systems that allow nutrients, carbon, and water to exchange between trees. Just as plants support each other, tune into how you can support the ecosystems of communities you hold. Tap into your communities when you need help. Encourage compassion and connection. I think this is a very, very beautiful way of understanding how necessary communal care is to how we can thrive, especially when we think of ourselves as a seed and then a plant and then a part of something so much larger like a garden. And how, sorry, how a garden and a plant can thrive with the help of other people, just like us. There are so many efforts and people that we can reach out to that contribute to our own growth. But yes, I thought this was very, very beautiful. Sorry, oh my gosh, that cough was what happens when you talk for long periods of time. But anyways, so just wanted to end also with some resources for y'all. Whether or not you're in the Irvine area, this is something that you can access. So the first is UCI Mutual Aid, which is organized by graduate students, undergraduate students at UCI in solidarity with COLA for All, or UCI for COLA, I mean. and they're doing direct resources. So if you are in need of monetary support, they have a forum that I have linked there as well. It's the bit.ly/mutual aid forum UCI. If you have anything specific that is not on that form that you are in need of, you can go ahead and reach out to their email. But yeah, and they also have other extensive lists of resources. If you go onto their either uciforcola.com/resources, they have so many, like, so much knowledge to share too, right? They have links to like pod mapping, so kind of like worksheets to understand like where we can like pull resources from. They have links to things, things like that. So I highly encourage you all to check them out. Reach out if you need help. Fill out that form. And then also the Fresh Basic Needs Hub. I acknowledge that this is a student-run space. So it is undergrad students that are literally working to make this possible for us. So if you take advantage of these resources, make sure to thank them, because they are literally running around making all of this possible and trying to alleviate food insecurity among students as much as they can. So if you're in the UCI area, they have pantry and food services. So they do bi-weekly pantry distributions in the form of a box or a bag. They also have the emergency meal swipe program. Dining halls are still open on campus for very limited hours. So if you are in the area and are in need of food assistance, they do have this. They also have the Farm to Fresh voucher. I actually went to go get mine today. But it's super dope. You sign up for a voucher and they give you about $30 worth of fresh produce at Tanaka Farms, which is about 3 miles of UCI. So that's another way to also get some free groceries and something that is fresh from the farm, right? And finally, they're still assisting with applying for CalFresh. If you do not already have CalFresh and you qualify, I highly encourage it, especially now. They're extending everyone's amount to the maximum, I believe, for April and May. So definitely get on that if you have not already. And if you qualify, the Fresh Basic Needs Hub is still offering assistance through Zoom on applying for that. But yeah. And these are the references. Pause this, screenshot this, but these are different articles or Instagram kind of pages that I pulled inspiration from to put this presentation together for y'all. But yeah, feel free to click on any, or not click on them, but search these up if you want to learn more about communal care, communal healing, and things like that. Thank you all for watching this. I hope that I was able to provide insight. I have my contact information there, my UCI email, my non-UCI email, as well as my Instagram handle. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you all. I'm just very happy to share my love for communal care and communal healing with y'all. And I wanted to leave y'all with a few quotes. So I put, and I tried looking for who said this, but I don't know exactly who. But I know I saw this on Twitter. And it may have been phrased differently. But if trauma is generational, then healing can be too. And I think this is very true, especially for folks that are coming from Black and Brown communities, immigrant communities. Our families and our communities have a lot of trauma that is passed on to us. But if that trauma can be transmitted through generations, then healing can be too. And I think if it starts with us, we can also pass it to generations past us. And it's a way of connecting with ancestors and our roots as well too. And I also just wanted to include some graphics. So if y'all don't follow Baby Anarchist, I highly recommend. Their art is super cute. Literally baby anarchist art. But I loved this one. Our power blossoms when we engage in acts of community care and mutual aid. So really recognizing our power collectively. And then finally, another one from Anika Isara from the Garden graphic earlier. Yeah, grounding creative ecosystems with compassion, connection, and active care. I really love that one. Highly encourage y'all to check out the full series. But that is it for me. Thank you all so much, and I'm wishing you all lots of love, light, safety, and healing during these very difficult times. Thank you all.